Hello, hello, hello everyone. My name is John Sierra and I'm a Tolkien scholar, which means that I'm generally speaking the guy that you can come to with any question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, or any of his reference works such as The History of Middle-earth, or questions about Tolkien himself, his translations of medieval literature and such. I'm the guy that's been studying it for over 30 years. So welcome to the channel, and of course I'm here to answer your questions. Now, if you want to ask a question, it's very simple. There are two ways that you can do that. The simplest way, the most direct way, is to just leave a comment and ask your question there, and I will probably answer it as, reply to your comment. But if you feel that your question is too complicated for a comment, or you want to be featured in a video, you want to do this through a site called Quora, and there's a link directly to my Quora account in the description. It's very easy to make an account there, and then all you have to do is click ask a question, ask your question, and actually if it has anything to do with Tolkien or his works, after you're done actually writing the question, it's going to have these a list of people that you could tag, and my name is going to be at or near the top of the list. I'm John Sierra on Quora as well, or you could just go to my link in the description and click to ask me a question there. And every week I just gather a bunch of questions that I've answered and read them out here to you and answer them here as well, feature them in the video, and we sort of have some fun with it. So let's start with our reading. Now last week I read from this. I got this recently, a physical copy at least. This is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And I actually decided to do another reading from this book. Last week I had done the first 7 stanzas of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And it's quite a long poem. It's over 100 stanzas. But that's not the only thing in this book. As a matter of fact, if we just were to cordon off the part that's Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, let's see. Well, that ends right around here. So it's about half, maybe a little less than half of the book. But there's other things in here. There's a Pearl, and there's a lecture. But what I want to read is a bit of Sir Orfeo. Now, Sir Orfeo was another bit of medieval literature in the form of a long-form poem. And in this case, it was also translated by J.R.R. Tolkien, and it's a medieval take on more of an ancient Greek story of Orpheus and Eurydice, but changed Orpheus to Sir Orfeo. So this is Tolkien's translation of Sir Orfeo. I'm going to read you the first bit of it. Once again, it is quite the lengthy poem. It goes for, I'll tell you in a moment here. There are 605 lines in the poem. 604 lines in the poem, actually. So we're not going to read the whole thing, obviously. But let's read the first bit of Sir Orfeo as translated by J.R.R. Tolkien. We often read and written find, as learned men do us remind, that lays that now the harpers sing are wrought of many a marvellous thing. Some are of weal and some of woe, and some do joy and gladness know. In some are guile and treachery told, and some the deeds that chanced of old. Some are of jests and ribaldry, and some are tales and fairy. Of all the things that men may heed, us most of love they sing indeed. In Britain all these lays are writ. There issued first in rhyming fit, concerning adventures in those days, whereof the Britons made their lays. For when they heard men anywhere tell of adventures that there were, they took their harps in their delight, and made a lay, and named it right. Of adventures that did once befall, some can tell you, but not all. Listen now, lordlings good and true, and Orfeo I will sing to you. So Orfeo was a king of old, in England lordship high did hold. Valour he had and hardihood, a courteous king whose gifts were good. His father from King Pluto came, his mother from Juno, king of fame, who once of old as gods were named, for mighty deeds they did and claimed. Sir Orfeo too, all things beyond, of harping sweet delight was fond. And sure were all good harpers there, of him to earn them honour fair. Himself he loved to touch the harp, and pluck the strings with fingers sharp. He played so well beneath the sun, a better harper was there none. No man hath in this world been born who would not, hearing him, have sworn that as before him Orfeo played, to joy of paradise he had strayed, and sound of harp as heavenly, such joy there was in melody. This king abode in transience, a city proud of stout defence. For Winchester 'tis certain then, as transience was known to men, there dwell his queen in fairest bliss, whom men call Lady Herodis. Of ladies then the one most fair, who ever flesh and blood did wear, in her did grace and goodness dwell, but none her loveliness can tell. It so did chance in early May, when glad and warm doth shine the day, and gone a bit of winter showers, and every field is filled with flowers. On every branch the blossom blows, in glory and in gladness grows. The Lady Herodis, the queen, two maidens fair to garden green, with her she took at drowsy tide of noon to stroll by orchard stride, to see the flowers there spread in spring, and hear the birds on branches sing. There down in shade they sat all three, beneath a fair young grafted tree, and soon it chanced the gentle queen fell there asleep upon the green. Her maidens durst not her awake, but let her lie, her rest to take, and so she slept till midday soon was past, and come was afternoon. Then suddenly they heard her wake, and cry, and grievous clamour make. She writhed with limb, her hands she wrung, she tore her face till blood there sprung, her raiment rich in pieces rent, thus sudden out of mind she went. Her maidens too then by her side no longer durst with her abide, but to the palace swiftly ran, and told their knight and squire and man, their queen it seemed was sudden mad. Go and restrain her, they them bade, both knights and ladies thither sped. And more than 60 damsels fled to the orchard, to the queen they went, with arms to lift her down they bent, and brought her to the bed at last. And raving there they held her fast, but ceaselessly she would still cry, and ever strove to rise and fly. When Orfeo heard these tidings sad, more grief than ever in life he had, and swiftly with 10 knights he sped to bower and soon before her bed. And looking on her ruefully, dear life, he said, what troubles thee? Whoever quiet hast been and sweet, why dost thou now so shrilly greet? Thy body that peerless white was born is now by cruel nails o'ertorn. Alas, thy cheeks that were so red are now as wan as thou wert dead. Thy fingers too, so small and slim, are stained with blood, their hue is dim. Alas, thy lovely eyes in woe now stare on me as on a foe. Ah, Lady, mercy I implore, these piteous cries come cry no more. But tell me what thee grieves and how, and say what may thee comfort now. That's about 115, 16 or so lines of it. I wanted to do 100 lines, but then it was in the middle of a stanza, so I decided to stop there. So, there's not a lot to talk about. It is, Orfeo is Orpheus, and of course the queen here, who has suddenly gone mad and is clawing and scraping at her face and drawing blood and ripping her clothes, and she just suddenly goes mad all of a sudden. That is, of course, Eurydice, which in this British retelling was called... Where is it? The name is Herodis. So you could see Orfeo, Orpheus, Herodis, Eurydice. And of course, we get these mentions of the gods using the Roman names like Pluto, which of course in Greek would be Hades, and Juno, which is Hera. And they're just... it's interesting that the Juno was Hera, but in this case, Juno was mentioned to be a king. Her mother from Juno, king of fame. So it's sort of interesting the way that it plays on it, that they've made the gods into kings. Now, the reason that I wanted to read the first part of this is because last week we'd read a little bit of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and I pointed out that Tolkien, probably with some degree of glee, translated the term Midgard as Middle Earth, which is absolutely, positively accurate. It is the way that you would translate Midgard to modern English. It would be Middle Earth. But obviously, Tolkien was having a little bit of fun with it, with Middle-earth. In this case, there's a reference here on the 10th line, and some are tales of faerie. Some are jests and ribaldry, and some are tales of faerie. And notice it's fairy spelled as an F-A-E-R-I-E, and the E with the umlaut on it, so it's not fairy, it's fairy. And Tolkien uses this phrase with a capital F as well, I should mention, to not say that it is a tale of fairy as in a fairy tale. Certainly not that. Because Tolkien, when speaking of the spelling of the word fairy, there was sort of two ways to spell it. One with F-A-E-R, and then it could end with a Y or an I-E, depending on aesthetic. And one with F-A-I-R-Y, or it could be I-E. And he actually, for the creatures of fairies, he preferred the second spelling, the F-A-I-R, because it has that word fair, which can mean a lot of different things, but the way that Tolkien specifically used the term fair was to mean beautiful, and he liked the idea that fairies were beautiful, and so they were called fairies. So linguistically to him it made sense. But if you notice in The Hobbit, Bilbo mentions Gandalf taking, in the early draft I should say, in the early draft he mentions Gandalf taking young hobbits across the sea to the other side, which is completely insane when we think of it in the terms of the legendarium, because it suggests then that Gandalf took hobbits to Aman, to the Undying Lands, which is not true. So in the later revision that became the both the first edition and the revised edition, the later drafts, the final drafts and the revised draft, he changed it to say that Gandalf took young hobbits on ships to other shores. So other parts of Middle-earth, right? Makes sense. But what is across the sea in this? Like, Tolkien was writing The Hobbit, and at this point, it's not related to the Silmarillion. He's already written parts of the Silmarillion. He's written drafts of Beren and Luthien. He's written drafts of the Children of Húrin. He's written drafts of the Fall of Gondolin. He has some of the framework of Quenta Silmarillion in there, and you see that in The Hobbit when he talks about the high elves, the sea elves, the wood elves, and the deep elves. The deep elves are the Noldor, the sea elves are the Teleri and the Fomari, and then of course there's the other one, the wood. Well, wood elves is Sylvan, but he also has a word for the Sindar as well, the gray elves. And basically, if you look on my channel, I have readings of The Hobbit, and I talk about this, how almost the entire like plot of the great journey from Middle-earth to the Undying Lands for the elves is told in The Hobbit in a very brief paragraph, summarized. But he mentions at one point the uttermost west as being called Faerie. And he doesn't use the umlaut, so it might be just fairy. But using that spelling, not the spelling that he used for fairies, which Bilbo says earlier, that there was a legend that a Took ancestor had married a fairy, and that's spelled F-A-I-R-Y, and it's a lowercase f because it's not a proper noun. It's not the name of a place or the name of a person or the name of a thing. It's a type of creature. So, but when he says fairy with the F-A-E, which is more connected to fey than fair, so more magical in nature than beautiful in nature, linguistically speaking, he is using a capital F because he's talking about a place. And there's another book that's a collection of stories called Tales from the Perilous Realm, which if you haven't heard of it, I recommend you check it out, because it's interesting of this idea of the realm of fairy, which is what is sort of outside of Middle-earth, Midgard, the dwelling of man, and it could refer to the Undying Lands or to anything that's outside of where we are, where people are. And he wrote a lot of stories about it. And The Hobbit was one of those stories that sort of referenced, yes, the perilous realm. He doesn't use the term the perilous realm in The Hobbit, but it is the perilous realm. It is fairy. And of course, we understand, well, what is over the west in the world of The Hobbit is Aman, the Undying Lands, or at least that's what was there. It was sundered from the world, but it is still to the west with a capital W. The world was flat. It was made round. The Undying Lands were sundered from the earth, but they're to the west with a capital W. Of course, Tolkien has this habit of capitalizing cardinal directions sometimes when he doesn't need to, like the east, sometimes he'll capitalize. But with west, there's a difference between going west and going west. And then you're really going into the perilous realm, where Elendil went, where Tuor went, where the elves went, and such. So it's interesting that Tolkien, in translating Sir Orfeo here, uses the term fairy with the umlaut in it, so that it's not pronounced fairy, it's pronounced fairy. But it's just very interesting to see that and to connect it to his body of work, because I think that Tolkien, when he did his translations, whether they were finished translations or not, whether it was Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or Sir Orfeo, or the Fall of Arthur, or the Jerusalem Bible, or what else did he do? He had a whole bunch of them. I mean, there was one that I had in my head that I was going to mention, and now it's sort of flown out of there. Oh hell, what was it? There's Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. There's Sir Orfeo. There's the Fall of Arthur. Oh, Beowulf, of course. Beowulf. How could I forget Beowulf? I mean, he was a professor who, when he was a professor, he was a professor of these Old English literature and linguistics, and Beowulf was like his bread and butter. So if you ever want to read a really, really great version of Beowulf, definitely get Tolkien's version. Maybe I have it digitally, but maybe I'll get a nice copy of it like I have of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and read it out to you guys one day. I mean, I could read the digital version too. It's just, we did that with one that I do have a physical version of, which is not readily accessible, which was the Book of Lost Tales. But I feel like then I'm like leaning in and like looking at the computer and reading, and it's not the same as holding a book. I will do that on occasion. In that case, it was specifically requested that I do a reading from the Book of Lost Tales. And if you want to see something represented, and you want to see me do a reading of something, let me know and I'll see what I can do. But anyway, we're going to get to your questions. We have 14 questions to get to today. So let's start with the first one. Why didn't Saruman order his Uruk-hai troops to kill Gandalf after he defeated him, instead of locking him up on the roof of Isengard? Well, there's a lot to unpack here. Killing Gandalf would do two things, neither of which would be good for Saruman in the long run, or even in the short run. The first is that it would deprive Saruman of a possible ally. Saruman did not defeat Gandalf. That's something that did happen in the movie, but we're speaking about the books here. He told him that he was going to be detained until he saw Saruman's way. So Saruman was sure in his mind that Gandalf would come to his senses and join him. Saruman never saw himself as the villain. He saw himself as the hero who had to take drastic measures, which was something that Gandalf reminded him makes him the villain. There's this theme that you see in almost all of Tolkien's work, that you can't do a good thing by evil means. It makes what you did evil. Saruman came up to the roof a few days later to check on Gandalf, and he found him gone. Now, obviously, in retrospect, killing him would have prevented his escape, but he thought that he couldn't possibly escape. He didn't know how Gandalf did it. He didn't account for an eagle showing up like that, because he didn't know, and Gandalf certainly wasn't telling him, that he had told Radagast before he had come to Isengard to send news, or send a messenger for news and with news after a few days. So that's why Gwaihir arrived there. The movie made it seem like they fought, obviously, and that they went up to the roof and they continued to fight, and then Gwaihir showed up pretty much immediately. There was a moth, and it was a whole thing. And it worked for the film. It worked perfectly well, but that's not how it actually works in Tolkien's version of The Lord of the Rings. I always say there's J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, and there's Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings. They're not the same thing. They share many, many similarities, but there are also differences, and this is one of them. And they're both wonderful in their own ways. I have nothing against Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings, even though I critique certain aspects of it here and there, but I overall really like those movies. So Saruman really thought that after a while, Gandalf's going to cool off. He's going to realize the situation he's in. He had sort of threatened that he was going to send him to Mordor and be tortured by Sauron himself. Saruman, of course, had no intention of doing any such thing, but he wanted Gandalf to believe that. And I don't think Gandalf actually believed it at this point. I think Gandalf was sort of coming out from under the spell of Saruman, of his voice, of listening to his charisma and believing every word that came out of his mouth, because Saruman had been lying to him and to Galadriel and to Elrond and to a great many people for a good long while now. And he's realizing that, whoa, wait, mate, this guy's a little off here. He's left the path. He's left the path of wisdom. So in Saruman's mind, Gandalf's just being silly. He's going to come around. We just need to just hold on to him for a while, maybe scare him a bit, and he'll join me. If he killed him, he's not going to have Gandalf as an ally. The second thing that killing Gandalf would do that would be a really big problem for Saruman is that now there's negative attention of either the Valar or Iluvatar himself. Now, remember what happened when Gandalf actually died. His spirit was plucked from the world by Iluvatar, and then he was sent back as the White to replace Saruman. Saruman may or may not have guessed that such a thing was possible, but he certainly wasn't going to kill a fellow Istar and get that sort of negative attention from basically his bosses, who he still thought he was serving. He didn't think that he was serving Sauron, even as he's basically doing Sauron's bidding. He still sees himself as an agent of Iluvatar, as an agent of the Valar. He doesn't understand that he's left the path of wisdom, even as Gandalf explained it to him. I had gotten a couple of really great comments here on this when I posted on Quora that I wanted to highlight here. Anthony Zarelia here says, there's a big difference between Dad, you left me in charge of my brothers and Gandalf misbehaved, so I put him in timeout. And Dad, I killed my brother. But to be fair, you did leave me in charge, and he did reject my authority. So that's a really good way of putting it. The other comment that I wanted to highlight here was Michael Hansen, who said, well, what if he made it look like an accident? Which, to answer that sort of follow-up question, I think that obviously Iluvatar is omnipotent and omnipresent. He sees all, he knows all. He's not going to be fooled by something like that. And Manwë can see just about everything that's going on if he's looking. And not to mention that Gandalf himself would not be gone. Whether his spirit goes to Valinor or whether it goes to Iluvatar, the spirit, Olorin, is still going to exist. He's an angel. He's not like a mortal who's just going to be gone and can't report back. It doesn't work that way. Well, anyway, let's get on to the next question. Here's a question that came in from Andrew Watson, and this is one of my favorite sort of questions, and it's something that seems like a very quick answer, a very quick yes or a very quick no, but there's always more going on, and I can talk a lot about a really interesting topic. And the question is, did Elros have pointed ears like his brother Elrond? So the question here is actually based off of a false premise. It is very likely that neither Elrond nor Elros had pointed ears. Elves having pointed ears is just one of those things that is in our social consciousness that we just sort of accept as a fact. We just think it's true. Tolkien thought otherwise. It should be noted that in the very earliest version of his works, he did not refer to these characters as elves at all, but he called them fairies, he called them gnomes. Gnomes, the term gnomes, that confused his friends, which were, who he was reading these stories to. They certainly weren't published at this point. And because when they heard gnome, like many people, like you probably do, they thought of these short little bearded fellows that would be sort of similar to dwarves. But the specific type of being known as a gnome in Tolkien's early legendarium became Noldo, which is a type of elf. Later, it would be pronounced Njoldo, according to his later spelling of it. Now, if you peruse The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, you'll notice that Tolkien never once refers to pointed ears for any race. In a letter, he did describe hobbits as having pointed ears, which he muddled the discussion by using the adjective elfish. Now, Tolkien may not have been saying that his elves had pointed ears in this note, but rather referencing this sort of common image that many people have of elfish ears being pointed. In the book The Lost Road and Other Writings, there's a note from Tolkien which states that the ears of the Quendi are more leaf-shaped than those of mortal men. Now, Quendi is a term that refers to essentially all of the elves. So he did in fact intend that his elves have differently shaped ears than mortals, though leaf-shaped is very vague. What type of leaf is he talking about? Many Tolkien scholars, myself included, have come to the conclusion that elves tend to have ears that would be slightly pointed, just like some people do in real life. This, of course, has nothing to do with Elrond or Elros, because neither of which are elves by Tolkien's strictest definition. Both are Perithel, which means half-elf, as they have both mortal ancestry and immortal ancestry. Both of their parents were also Perithel. Their father, Eärendil, was born to a mortal man named Tur, and to an immortal mother named Idril, and their mother, Elwing, was born of a mortal man named Dior, and an immortal mother named Nimloth. Now, Dior's ancestry is even more complex because his father, Beren, was mortal, but his mother, Luthien, was not only immortal, but she was sort of a half-elf in a sense as well, because her mother was Melian, a Maiar, which is essentially a lesser angel. Perithel are by their nature mortal. Mortal blood takes precedence over immortal blood when it comes to ancestry. Tolkien also says in letter 345 that he does not consider Arwen to be an elf. And I'm going to read that paragraph here. Some of it's not related to it, but I just wanted to include the full paragraph so nobody accuses me of just cherry picking here. Arwen was not an elf, but one of the half-elven who abandoned her elvish rights. Galadriel, glittering garland, is the chief elvish woman mentioned in The Lord of the Rings. Her daughter was Celebrian, Silver Queen. There was also Nimrodel, but I shouldn't really like those names to be given to heifers or cows. That's what the initial letter that was sent to him about naming cows and after characters, and they were asking for, elvish names like Arwen. And he said, Arwen's not really an elf. He does continue on here about specifically referencing Farmer Giles of Ham, and say that might be more suitable to take a name from there. So anyway, Perithel, like Dior, Eärendil, Elwing, they were mortal by birth. Dior would have lived a normal lifespan, maybe a longer than average lifespan, but a mortal lifespan if he had lived past his 30s, which he did not. But Eärendil and Elwing did something important that changed the game up in a really big way. They sailed to the west with a capital W. They were allowed to stay, but they could not straddle the line between man and elf. They had to choose a doom. Immortal? Mortal. They both chose to be immortal. And their twin sons, Elrond, Elros, they were also given the same choice. Elrond chose immortality, and Elros chose mortality. Now, we don't know the name of Elros' wife, but she would have been the first queen consort of Númenor. She was mortal, whoever she was. And so their children and their scions ever after were not visited with this choice. They were just mortal, though they enjoyed a greater lifespan, even greater than those of the run-of-the-mill men of Númenor. Elrond, though he married an immortal Celebrian, the mortal blood that he carried on did give their three children, Elladan, Elrohir, and Arwen, the same choice. They were still Perithel, hence Tolkien's claim that Arwen was not an elf, his exact words. So, all of that is to say that while it is true that the ears of the Quendi, the elves, may look different in some very likely subtle way to the ears of mortal men, Elrond and Elros were neither. They were also twins. And Tolkien never specified whether they were what we would call identical twins or whether they were what we call fraternal twins, and that the same goes for Elrond's twin sons. We don't know if they were identical or fraternal, but it is very likely that they looked similar to each other, and they made their choices when they were already adults. And I don't see one of the Valar, like Namo, showing up with a scalpel to shave down Elros' ears once his choice was made. It just didn't work that way. So if we believe that they had pointed ears, they would have both had pointed ears from birth. And if they believe that they did not have pointed ears, they would never have had pointed ears. So really, like I said, Tolkien, like I said, he did say that the ears of the elves were more leaf-shaped than the ears of men, which the wording to it makes it seem like it's probably a subtle distinction, if anything. But he was also very insistent that there were no physiological differences between a man and an elf, that were both basically the same species, which is proven by not only the fact that elves and men can have children together, but that those children can have children. That's what basically makes us the same species, that the difference between us is spiritual. Now, you may be able to see a man and an elf and say that one's the elf and that one's the man based on one being more beautiful than the other. Maybe the man has a beard. Elves don't grow beards except for some very, very specific circumstances. Or maybe you'll just notice a very, very slight change in the ears or the shining in the elf's eyes. But it wouldn't be like the big, pointy, like sort of knife-shaped ears that you see in Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings, or in Amazon's The Lord of the Rings, or in very many pictures and drawings that people draw. There you have it. Like I said, it seems like a very quick yes or no, but there was a lot to say about it. One of my favorite types of questions to tackle here. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so here's our next question. Do you think Adar, the orc leader in the Rings of Power TV series, deserved what he got, or not really? Deserve? There are many that live that deserve death, and many that die that deserve life. Can you give it to them? Little quote from Gandalf there. Adar's story kind of came full circle. The orcs did to him exactly what he had them do to Sauron. Adar wanted the orcs to be better, to not always choose evil, to live in peace, and they slashed him to ribbons for it. It's easy to say that he didn't deserve that. He was trying to do the right thing, but this was kind of only after he had donned Nenya. He saw with greater wisdom than he ever had in the past. He surrendered Nenya back to Galadriel. He made a pact with her, only to find that the orcs did what orcs always do. They betrayed him and they joined Sauron. He cared, right? Except that he didn't. He sent out a troll at Eregion even after his son warned him that it was just going to kill more orcs. And the troll didn't kill a single elf. It mostly just rampaged around killing orcs until Elrond and Gil-galad come and put it down. So he talked a big talk about caring for his children, but he was very single-minded in trying to attain victory over Sauron, and he did not understand why he was wrong until he very briefly wore a ring of power. So I would say that he reaped what he sowed, I suppose, or what Melkor sowed. It really comes down to it, like, I feel it's improper to say whether he deserved his fate or not, but I will say that from a storytelling perspective, his fate makes absolute sense. You kind of knew he was going to go out that way, is what I'm saying. Yeah, that's really all there is to say about Adar. Very interesting character. I like what they did with him, but yeah, in the end, did he deserve that? Not for me to say, but I'm just saying that it makes sense. Okay, next question. Here is a question that comes in from Kamali Kokavali, who asks, are Aragorn and Elendil equal in strength, combat, and bravery? No, and debatable. You'll notice through even casual study of Tolkien's work that he has this consistent theme of diminishment over time. The further back you go in his timeline, the bigger the conflicts get, the more grandiose the storytelling, the greater the heroes, the more terrible the villains. The Third Age doesn't have someone as strong as Beren or Túrin, or anyone as powerful in magic as Lúthien, or an evil as mighty as Morgoth. This includes the men of Númenor. Aragorn is not as great as Elendil. Elendil is not as great as Elros was, and going even further back, Elros would be a blip on the radar compared to his grandfather Túr. So, in terms of strength and skill in combat, let's say that the One Ring had not been destroyed, and Sauron joins the battle at the Black Gate. Instead of facing Elendil and Gil-galad, he would be facing Aragorn, Imrahil, and Gandalf the White. Now, Gandalf the White, we kind of have to take him out of the equation because we're talking about men and elves here. We're not talking about angels. He's closer to being Sauron's equal. But we can see how Aragorn would be in this hypothetical sort of a stand-in for his ancestor Elendil. And Imrahil, who's a man with some elvish ancestry, is the closest that we could get to Gil-galad, though his ancestry is Sylvan rather than Noldor. I'm not knocking Imrahil here, but he's no Gil-galad, neither is Legolas, who's a Sindar prince, not a Noldor high king. So Sauron would just mop them all up, with the only one able to really put up a real fight would be Gandalf the White. And he would lose, though he would fight to the bitter end. Sauron himself is not as strong as he was earlier, but he's still the strongest thing in Middle-earth. Bravery, however, that's a very different thing. The heroes of the Third Age are not as powerful or as magnificent as those of the First Age and the Second Age, but that doesn't mean they're less brave. I would argue that being less powerful, but still going up against the great evil of the world, makes them more brave. This is, of course, a matter of opinion. I would say that Aragorn is potentially more brave than Elendil, but Elendil is also barely a character in the narrative. We know a lot less about him and his personality than we know about Aragorn, so we kind of just know Aragorn better, and we might favor him. It's sort of a bias of opinion in that sense, but I hope that was helpful. Let's move on to the next question. Here's a question that came in from Emma, who asks, is there anything Tolkien left out of The Lord of the Rings that she wish he had included? Well, okay, so personally, I would have liked to have seen more of Arwen and of Éowyn. Éowyn and Arwen are both characters that were solidified rather late in the writing, and as such are slightly unfinished. Éowyn herself is a composite character. She's made from mashing two characters into one. There was the original version of Éowyn and another character named Edis. Now, Éowyn, the original version, was Éomer's sister, as she is in the final draft, and Edis was Theodred's sister, Théoden's daughter. So they would have been cousins. Tolkien felt that Edis was sort of pointless as a character, so he just sort of erased her from the story and gave bits of her personality, some traits to Éowyn. So the issue with Éowyn is Arwen. Arwen was added very late in the story. The original plan was that Aragorn would fall in love with Éowyn and he was going to marry her, and then she was going to be the queen of Gondor. However, as Tolkien came to see Aragorn as a Third Age analog of Beren, he decided that Beren needs a Lúthien, and thus he conceived that Elrond had a daughter who was very much like Lúthien in her looks, though not nearly as majestic as her in terms of power. Éowyn gets shunted to the side, and she gets this love story with Faramir as they both recuperated from their wounds in Minas Tirith. However, Arwen's addition was so late that the majority of the love story between her and Aragorn is told in the appendix. So I'd have liked this story to be more integrated into the actual text. Okay, next question. Here's a question that comes in from, and I hope I say this right, Vamsi Pritham Pingali, who asks, how did the council plan on driving out Sauron from Mirkwood when the Istari were not permitted to match his power with power? So it honestly seems like them just showing up was enough. Gandalf, Radagast, and Saruman were not supposed to fight Sauron, and they didn't. But the likes of Elrond and Galadriel are not under any sort of restriction, nor would any of the other possible members of the White Council. We don't really know the full membership, but it's very possible that Celeborn, and Théoden were present, for example. Gandalf had been to Dol-Guldur twice before. On his most recent visit, he had come in secret, and he was able to identify that the necromancer is Sauron. And he got the map and the key of Erebor from Thrain II to pass on to his son Thorin II. The first time, though, Gandalf came openly to investigate the identity of the necromancy, and Sauron, not wanting to be exposed, hid himself away. Sauron did not have a big army or even any of his followers. The Nazgûl were in Mordor waiting for him. He was not looking for fight, nor would he know that these wizards were not supposed to match his power with their own. And seeing himself outmatched, he left. So Gandalf isn't specific about how exactly they drove him out, but he gives all the credit to Saruman. It was by some device of Saruman that Sauron fled. So we can imagine what this would have been. Perhaps Saruman, through his magic, made it seem that they were coming with a much larger force. But either way, there was no actual battle, but Sauron decided to make a tactical retreat. Okay, next question. Okay, so here's a question that actually came in from two different people, from both Arthur Major and Stephen Ritter. And I've gotten this question in the past and I've answered a few times, but I don't think I've ever featured it in a video, and we're making this the thumbnail question. Why did Sauron choose to attack Gondor before Rohan? Was Rohan considered stronger than Gondor at the time of the attack? So it has nothing to do with which one was stronger, but everything to do with geography. Geography is very important when it comes to wars. Sauron has two viable options for issuing forth large numbers of troops out of Mordor. He could use Morannon, which is the Black Gate, or he could use Minas Morgul. Now, Minas Morgul is directly to the east of Osgiliath. It's basically right there, which his forces eventually occupied. But just beyond Osgiliath is Minas Tirith. Getting to Rohan through this would involve either going up the rivers or staying to the south of the rivers. Now, staying to the south of the rivers is not going to happen because they're going through too much of Gondor to get to Rohan. It's obvious. At Minas Tirith, which literally translates to the Tower of Watchfulness, they're going to see a large army passing by going to Rohan, and they're going to flank them. Going up the rivers, it doesn't work because it's upstream, and a large army is not going to be able to go upstream like that. So if they decide to go out from the Black Gate, that's actually even worse. They would have to go through the Dead Marshes and the Emyn Muil, talk about some hostile territory, and then they would have to cross several rivers, only to have Rohan shored up at Helm's Deep. You ever wonder why in the Two Towers Rohan wasn't able to get word to Gondor to ask for assistance? The attack was coming from the other side, from Isengard. It's much, much closer, and the troops did not have to pass by Minas Tirith to get there. Rohan coming to Gondor's aid was a problem for Sauron, and he thought Saruman could at least jam them up. It was his best bet to take Rohan out of the equation so he could attack Gondor. Giving time, he would have amassed a much larger force, and he would have easily crushed Gondor and Rohan, but he had been led to believe that the One Ring was in Minas Tirith, and that made him act rashly. Okay, next question. So this is a really quick one. This next question comes in from Frank McGreen, who asks, does Sauron wear the ring during the battle with Gil-galad and Elendil? Yes, of course he did. The chain of custody of the One Ring is pretty easy to follow, and this is the point where it passed from Sauron to Isildur, who cut the ring from the Dark Lord's finger. So considering that the event that happened just prior to this was Sauron being, just lying on the ground and getting his finger cut off, before that was the battle with Elendil and Gil-galad. So it stands to reason that, yeah, he was definitely wearing the ring there. I suppose that the question that some may come up is, well, then how come we can see him? When we see characters in the Lord of the Rings wear the ring, whether it's Deagle never got to wear it, but Smeagol wore it and he vanished. Bilbo vanished when he wore it. Frodo vanished when he wore it. Sam vanished when he wore it. Isildur vanished when he wore it. The exception, Bombadil. Bombadil is sort of very different. The ring doesn't affect him. As a matter of fact, when he put the ring onto his finger, he was able to make the ring vanish, which freaked Frodo out to the point where Frodo even wondered, like, is that, when he handed it back to him, is that my ring, or did you do some sort of trickery? So then Frodo put it on to see if it was still the same ring, and his friends were not able to see him, but Bombadil was able to see him. So Bombadil is a spirit, and he's very different, but Sauron is also a spirit, and he's not an incarnate spirit like Gandalf or like Saruman or Radagast, but he is a one of the Ainur that has not incarnated. He does have a body, which is called a Fana. Now, when you're incarnate, your body is called a Hroa, which is basically, you are a two-part being. You have a soul, which is called a Fea, and a body, which is called a Hroa. However, with the incarnates, they don't really have a body. They use a body as clothes. So what you're seeing when you see Sauron, you're not really seeing him. You're seeing his clothes. We can't see the true form of Sauron because the children of Iluvatar, and that's elves and men, cannot see spirits. There might be exceptions to this. There might be very special circumstances to this. But normally speaking, we can't see spirits. So when Sauron puts the ring on his finger, he doesn't vanish because he's already in that spirit world that most people cannot see, that people are drawn into when they wear the One Ring. And of course, Sauron never intended for anyone but him to wear the ring. So of course he was wearing it. He was pretty much always wearing it from the moment he first put it on until Isildur cut it from his fingers. Even when he was in Numenor, it was hidden, but he had it on his finger. Okay, next question. Why didn't Sauron send a couple of Nazgûl to Isengard to lead Saruman's forces in battle against Rohan and keep a close eye on Saruman, which would ensure victory against Rohan and Saruman behaving himself and not being a traitor anymore? So the easy way to answer this is that Sauron doesn't really care about Saruman. Saruman is not Sauron's buddy. Saruman is not necessary for Sauron's victory. He's just another enemy. Saruman attempted to trick the Dark Lord into believing that he had switched sides, and he was willing to not only attack Rohan, but to commit several war crimes along the way to prove it. But he was insincere, and Sauron knew this from the first time that they ever spoke. To Sauron, Saruman's what we would call a useful idiot. He would potentially help the Dark Lord by attacking Rohan, but Sauron didn't particularly care whether or not he won. He was looking for the One Ring. Once Pippin contacted Sauron, the Dark Lord assumed that Saruman had the ring bearer, and therefore also the ring, and when he sent a Nazgûl, he learned several things. Saruman lost, Saruman did not have any halflings, Saruman did not have the One Ring, and Saruman did not even have the Palantir anymore. So Aragorn contacting Sauron spurred him to attack Gondor much sooner than expected, as I mentioned earlier. And of course, it would have been nice for Sauron if Saruman had prevented Rohan from helping Gondor, but even this was a temporary loss only for Sauron. He was going to win eventually, except of course for Frodo and Sam and Gollum and Mordor and destroying the ring. That's what really got him in the end. Okay, next question. So here's another Saruman question, and this is somewhat related, but how was Saruman able to create a large number of Uruks in the Two Towers? Was Isengard the only place capable of producing them before that point? So I could kind of tell from the wording here that I think this is mostly based off of the movie, but Saruman did not create Uruks, he bred them. And it was something that had been going on for quite a long time. Now, the film version made it seem like Saruman had very hastily pulled a large force of Uruk-hai out of the literal ground. The reality in the book was way more realistic, Uruk-hai are a cross of Uruks, also known as orcs or goblins, and men. He bred the two together, and it was something that had been going on for quite some time for him to have such a force. Far earlier in Book 1, Frodo and company ran into several shady men in Bree, and they're described as being part orc. Book 6 reveals that a lot of these same types followed Saruman to the Shire. These half-orcs were indeed Saruman's men spying on Frodo. They were also likely part of the breeding stock used to create Uruk-hai. So there's nothing particular about Isengard that makes it a breeding ground. It's just where Saruman had set up shop and where he pretty much was left alone. It is technically part of Gondor, but the nearest neighbor was Rohan. Saruman had pretty much had Rohan in his hands at this point through Grima Wormtongue, so nobody was really checking on him. Okay, next question. Our next question comes in from Jerry Friedman, who asks, when did Tom Bombadil know the dark under the stars when it was fearless, before the Dark Lord came from outside? In the Silmarillion, Melkor is in Arda from the first. I'd be grateful to know your source. So that's easy. This is sort of a little bit based off a misconception of a quote from the Silmarillion. Before I tackle this, I'd like to take this quote and put it back into its context. So here's the full paragraph I'm going to read to you. But when the Valar entered into Ea, they were at first astounded and at a loss, for it was as if naught was yet made, which they had seen in vision, and all was but on point to begin, and yet unshaped, and it was dark. For the great music had been but the growth and flowering of thought in the timeless halls, and the vision only of foreshowing. But now they had entered in at the beginning of time, and the Valar perceived that the world had been foreshadowed and foresung, and they must achieve it. So began their great labors in wastes unmeasured and unexplored, and in ages uncounted and forgotten, until the deeps of time and in the midst of the vast halls of Ea, there came to be that hour and that place, where was made the habitation of the children of Iluvatar. And in this work the chief part was taken by Manwë, and Aule, and Ulmo, but Melkor too was there from the first, and he meddled in all that was done, turning it, if he might, to his own desires and purposes, and he kindled great fires. When therefore earth was yet young and full of flame, Melkor coveted it, and he said to the other Valar, This shall be my own kingdom, and I name it unto myself. So, as is quite typical with the Silmarillion, a lot happens in a single paragraph. So let's parse it and sort of break it all down. The Valar enter Ea, which is the created world, which contains Arda, which is the planet Ambar, which is sometimes also referred to as Arda, and the surrounding area. They had seen a vision of the created world given to them by Iluvatar previous to entering, but the reality did not match their vision. The vision was a foreshowing, showing the potential of the created world. The Valar came from the timeless halls, and how now they had to contend with the concept of time. Things had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they have entered the world at the beginning. For a very long time, as is said in the quote, ages uncounted and forgotten, they worked on forming the world to their liking. The children of Iluvatar, the elves and the men, were not awakened yet, and the Valar did not know when they would. The Valar who did the most to form the world were Manwë, Aule, and Ulmo. They represent the sky, the land, and the sea, and this makes a lot of sense. Now we get to the quote. It doesn't say Melkor was there from the first. It says Melkor too was there from the first. The meaning of this statement is to convey that while Manwë and Aule and Ulmo, and the rest of them as well, were hard at work, so too was Melkor, as he did not wait for them to finish shaping the world before he just decided to wreck it. He was meddling in the shaping of the world from the very start. The most important bit, though, is at the very start of the paragraph, where it says, but when the Valar entered into Ea. Ea was created, and then the Valar entered into it, but before they came from the outside, Bombadil was already there. He predates the Valar in the realm of time, though they themselves predate the world from the outside, and they had a hand in creating the world from the start of time. Bombadil was there in the earth. So a line in Ainu Lindala makes a strong case for the nature of Bombadil, who was there before the world was shaped. Iluvatar took the light of creation, the flame imperishable, also known as the secret fire, and imparted it into the heart of Ea. This shows that creation in the world started before the Valar entered. And the person who asked this, Jerry, he actually asked a follow-up question. I'm going to read his comment here. He says, "Thank you, John. My difficulty with that is, but when the Valar entered into Ea, they were at first astounded and at a loss, for it was as if naught was yet made, which they had seen in vision, and all was but on point to begin and yet unshaped, and it was dark. If it was dark and all was yet unshaped, then there were no stars until the Valar made them." That's true. So, assuming Melkor entered with the other Valar, how could there be a time when the dark under the stars was fearless before the Dark Lord came out to the outside? And to answer this, I would say there was nobody around to be afraid of the dark. There wasn't men, there wasn't elves, they weren't awakened yet. Tom wasn't afraid of anything, so he was not fearful under the stars. But when the men and the elves awake, first the elves awaked, Varda created the stars, and then after Melkor had cast the lamps down and the Valar had moved from Middle-earth to the Undying Lands, and they created the two trees there, they knew that Middle-earth was in darkness. So Varda created more stars. She made the night sky even brighter so that the elves and the men would have lights that they could see. But when Melkor started absolutely wrecking things, and especially with mortals, because mortals die, and Melkor is out there telling them that he's God, he created the world, and there's nothing beyond it. There's nothing outside the circles of the world, and there's nothing after death. There's just me. And some men believed this, and they became fearful, because this was this incredibly powerful being, the most powerful being in the entire world at this point. And there's not really that much of a reason to disbelieve him other than what the elves might say or what the Valar might say. But men are not necessarily going to believe the elves, and they don't really talk to the Valar, except for Tuor talking to Ulmo, and of course Melkor is one of the Valar. So basically, yes, there was a time where there were stars, and there was no fear of the dark because there were no people to be afraid of the dark. Okay, let's move on to the next question. If Tolkien's works were intended to be realistic world building, where would Middle-earth be located geographically on Earth? So basically, everything that isn't North America, South America, and Australia is Middle-earth. On a linguistic level, it's all Middle-earth. I kind of alluded to this earlier, and I talked about it a great deal in last week's episode. So I'm going to show this map here. This map shows Europe overlaid over the portion of Middle-earth we are the most familiar with, containing Eriador, Lindon, Rovanian, the Southlands, all of it, as well as the edges of places like Harad and Rhûn. This lines up with the Shire being England and Gondor being Italy, which are both things that Tolkien himself had stated. Of course, it's not a one-to-one match. It's not shaped exactly like Europe. But the land changed many times. Beleriand fell, and before that, the entire shape of Middle-earth was very different. We are most familiar with the Europe part, but there are lands to the east that represent Asia, and in an early draft of The Hobbit, Bilbo even mentions China as being a land that's far off to the east. Of course, Middle-earth isn't even mentioned in The Hobbit, not even in the final revision, but that's just the way it was. And to the south, there is an Africa analog. Though Middle-earth was a supercontinent that represents Europe and Africa and Asia, it is also linguistically derived from Midgard, which over time became Middle-Yard and then Middle-earth. It essentially means where men dwell. And as the Ainur and the elves withdrew from the land and go to Aemon, a land originally across the sea to the west, now sundered from the world by God, this becomes more and more true. Tolkien described the modern world as being in the 6th or perhaps the early 7th age, and Gandalf in Book 2 made a comment about chucking the One Ring into the sea being a bad idea for several reasons, but one of them was that the land changes over time, especially when you consider world-shattering events such as the Akalabeth. There is no analog of the Americas or Australia mentioned in Tolkien's work, but as his work represents a mythical past, we can assume that sometime after the Third Age, these lands rose up, and Middle-earth shape changed to be what it is today. As men dwell in these new lands, we can say that they, too, are Middle-earth. Okay, now we're going to move on to our final question. So our final question comes in from Kumali Kokavali, who asks, are Théoden's aid the most important things for victory at Pelennor Fields? I would say that not just Théoden is very important, but also Aragorn. Théoden and Aragorn were both incredibly and perhaps equally important for victory at Pelennor Fields. Gondor was on the brink of defeat when Rohan arrived. The walls had been smashed. Denethor was a gibbering mess, waving a knife at people trying to go out on his own terms and take Faramir with him. And only Gandalf the White stood in the way of the Witch King, other than he and Shadowfax. All other men and beasts had fled before the Witch King. Rohan's arrival was just in time, and it was a huge boost to morale. However, that's not the entire story. Théoden was quickly lost, and even though Éowyn and Merry defeated the Witch King, there were still 8 other Nazgûl out there, and Éowyn was taken out of the battle completely. Even her brother Éomer initially thought she had died. Sauron's forces were rallying. They were actually surprised by Rohan, but they had the greater numbers, and they were counting on backup as well, the Corsairs of Umbar. So their plan became hold out and wait for their own Riders of Rohan moment when those ships would come up the Anduin River, and that would be the end of Gondor, or at least the end of Minas Tirith. However, when the ships arrived, the standard of Gondor made by Arwen was unveiled. They knew they're cooked at this moment. There's no backup for Mordor. There's just Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli and Elladan and Elrond here and a whole bunch of Dunedain and Free slaves. So, basically, I would say that it was Aragorn that won them the battle, but it was Théoden that staved off defeat long enough for Aragorn to arrive. So I would say they were equally important in this case. So anyway, that was our final question. I had a lot of fun this week. I usually do. Really enjoy answering your questions. Leave me some comments if you have questions or you want follow-up questions to anything I've said, or you can go to Quora, of course. And if you've reached the end of the video and you've watched the whole thing, definitely subscribe if you haven't already. There's a very good reason to subscribe because it helps me out. It really does. Also, if you really want to help me out and you want to go a little bit extra, consider membership. Buying a membership is very cheap. It's only like $5 a month. And for that, you get all of the videos early and some other perks such as emotes and stuff. And that's all going to be, the emotes are going to become way more relevant when we start doing streams on this channel, which is going to be somewhat soon. I think once we hit 2K. Originally, I had it further out there, but financially, things are turning out a little better than expected with the channel, so I've moved that up. So I think once we hit 2,000 subscribers, I'm going to start doing streams on here, and you guys will be able to use the emotes in the chat. We have like a One Ring emote, we have an Eye of Sauron, and a few other things. I forget what. There's a Silmaril as well. But anyway, thank you guys for coming by. Thank you to the members for supporting me. Thank you to everyone that has subscribed and hit the like button and shared it and all that stuff that YouTubers always ask you to do. We'll see you guys next week.